Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for AI in the publishing supply chain. Today, we're going to be taking a look at service providers as part of that industry survey that BISG did in partnership with Booknight Canada in summer 2025, taking a look at AI adoption across the supply chain. Couple notes for housekeeping and logistics. This session is being recorded, so the link to the video is going to be shared with all registrants after the event. Usually takes us about a week to pull that together. The slide deck will also be included with all of those resources. We have time for Q&A at the end of the session as well. We're going to save roughly 15 minutes for that. But if our last webinar on the publisher space was any indicator, you guys are going to have a lot of questions. So any questions that we don't have time to get to, we'll make sure that we answer and send out with that resource as well. So please do look forward to the presentation and go ahead and drop those questions in the Q&A as they come up. So I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Brooke Horn. I'm the Membership and Operations Manager for BISG. What that really means is that I spend the majority of my time at BISG supporting our committees and our working groups, including the AI working group. My background has been pretty varied. I've spent time as an acquisitions editor. I've worked in marketing and publicity. I've worked as a retailer for both independent and large bookstores. So I kind of have a lot of hats that I've worn across the industry. And it's been an honor and a pleasure to bring that experience to BISG in support of the work and the research that we do. I'm joined today by Brooke Dobson, so you get two Brookes in one webinar. Brooke is co-founder and chief commercial officer of Shimmer AI, and I'll let her say a little bit about herself. Brooke, thanks so much for joining.
I have joked with Brooke before that before I came to the publishing industry, I had never met so many Brookes in all my life, and there are quite a few of them here. I'm co-founder and chief commercial officer at Shimmer AI. So my experience with AI comes from kind of dual-sided over the last several years. The product that Shimmer builds is an AI product that is for publishers, for authors, for this industry. But we also run our operations using AI. So we use AI throughout our own business workflow, from finance and accounting to operations to legal to how we do our marketing, sales, some areas of customer experience. So I've taken that knowledge and basically hands-on experience and have done various, trainings and boot camps, and now have a consulting practice with some others from Shimmer called Twigs. Won't get into the detail about that or the name, but that's the experience that I bring to this conversation, and also being, of course, on the supplier side myself, which is what this particular webinar is about.
Absolutely. And Brooke, thank you so much for your participation in the AI working group. Your feedback as we went through the white paper draft and kind of formulated those results was really helpful. So we really appreciate your time today. So shall we dive right into it?
Let's do it.
All right. So before we get started, I want to just do a little bit of a shout out about BISG's AI working group, because that's really kind of the foundation and the bedrock for the programming that BISG has done and the survey data that we're going to be taking a look at. Formed in 2023, the AI working group is fully staffed by volunteers. We meet every month and we have 4 key objectives. We want to collect and evaluate info on AI applications used in book publishing, lead, facilitate discussions on both effective and concerning uses of AI, propose best practices that balance innovation with safeguards for IP, privacy, and bias, and publish those findings and recommendations for the industry. So BISG is not advocating either for or against AI. We are a neutral party, and we're just trying to provide as much information as possible so that our members and the industry at large can be equipped to make the choices that are best for them and for their businesses and workflows. In summer of 2025, as I mentioned, BISG's AI working group launched an industry survey in partnership with Booknight Canada. The working group volunteers were highly involved. There were stakeholders from all across the industry and the various segments that we represent that really spent a lot of time putting the survey questions together, thinking carefully through the considerations. And keep in mind that in the time from when the working group was founded in December 23 to when the survey was finished and launched in summer 2025, AI drastically changed. And again, we're seeing a huge change from last year's survey to where we're at now. But we're going to take a look at that historical data and kind of set a framework for what we could expect in the future. Today, we're going to be talking specifically about the industry partner, that service provider segment. But if you want to take a look at the entire overview, the deep dive into all of the data that we collected, take a look at the full white paper on BISG's Knowledge Center, or also available through our partner at BookNet Canada. So what were the results? What were kind of the big takeaways of all of that individual data that we looked at across all segments? 46% of individuals were adopting AI. 25% were seeking AI training. 98% of individuals reported concerns and pain points around AI, and 31% said that they were ethically opposed to AI. So, what's the big takeaway there? The industry is adopting AI faster than it's becoming comfortable with it. It is actively seeking training, it is looking for workflows, but the reservations and the concerns still remain at an all-time high. Just want to clarify that we had 559 responses total. For the purposes of the survey, we wanted to look exclusively at those responses from US and Canadian professionals because they have the most relevance for our work in the market. So that segment was 521. And then out of that 521 responses, 35 were from service providers. Now, this is admittedly a small segment when you look at how many responses that we got from libraries or from publishers. They're a really, really important part of the industry, and the comparison of the data is pretty stark when you look at them together. So, in the interest of making sure that we understand the full scope of the supply chain and have that holistic overview of how all those segments work together, we're going to be taking a close look at the service provider responses today. So, shall we get started? Some level setting. Who responded? It's important when we consider this that we're looking at what career level, what position, the industry size from the responses. So the perspective that's being shared here is mostly from senior level professionals that said that they work in editorial, marketing, acquisitions, and production workflows. And most of them, at 31.43%, have between 15 and 25 years of experience. They're also from very large organizations. That over half of the survey responses for this segment coming from organizations that have over 100 employees. Now, individual sentiment and usage. This is kind of one of the starkest differences in the data when you look at service providers versus libraries versus publishers. It's that they are overwhelmingly using AI tools for work. 82.35% of individuals said that yes, they're using AI tools in their work. And almost 80% said that, yes, AI training is a good use of your time. We'll look at the comparison of the library versus the publisher statistics a little bit later, but this is markedly higher than for any other segment. Diving in a little bit further, how individuals feel about AI training. We asked them, as an individual, your own person, your perspective, why or why not do you see the AI training as a good use of your time? And 38% plus said that AI training is essential to their work. Another 38% said that it is a good use of time, but it's not a current priority. We're only seeing 14%, almost 15% in this segment saying that they're ethically opposed to the use of AI. When you compare that to that over 30% for the whole data set across all of the industry segments that we received, it's a pretty big comparison. Now, I think the one thing that we're probably most curious about, at least the folks that I talk to in the day-to-day in the industry, is how are you using AI? Where are you using AI? So individuals reported that they're mostly using AI in administrative and operational tasks, scheduling, meeting notes, email management, those kinds of repetitive day-to-day tasks that can end up being major time sinks but are critically important to our work. Secondly, was data analysis and reporting, followed by marketing, editorial, sales forecasting, and market analysis. Only 14% of the segment said that they're not actually using AI in any area of their work. In comparison, we also asked how is your organization formally using AI tools? What are you currently using as an organization? What have you formally adopted? And 62% said that they had adopted it for administrative or operational use. Over 55% they were using it for data analysis and reporting, code development and management for digital products, metadata and title optimization. We always love to see BISAC codes out in the world. And also at 51.72%, marketing. 10% of organizations said that they're not using AI in any area of their work. Kind of looking ahead, we asked organizations to anticipate where do they think that they're going to uptake use of AI tools in. 75.86% said data analysis or reporting. So we're seeing that raise as people expect to use that more. Administrative and operational remain strong with increasing adoption over time expected. Marketing, code development, and metadata all up there on the top still. And this is important to point out, only 3.45% or one single organization responded that they don't anticipate using AI in any area of their work. That's a pretty overwhelming statistic, even considering the small data set that we're looking at today. Now, guardrails. We talk time and time again about the need for human in the loop, about walled gardens, about the need to have policy and best practices. So we asked in the survey, does your organization currently have an official AI policy or set of guidelines and best practices? And they responded overwhelmingly yes. Over 65% said that our organization has an official AI policy or set of guidelines. And 13% said that they're actually in development for that. So when you take those two data sets together, it's a pretty significant size. Organizations are also encouraging pretty broadly the use of AI within controlled workflows. A little bit less than half, little bit less than 30% saying that they encourage experimentation freely. So again, there's that higher emphasis on guardrails and workflows and organizational ways to implement that. And only 10% are saying that their organization is actively discouraging the use of AI. We also asked people for some qualitative responses here. So in their own words, we heard things like, my organization hasn't acknowledged any AI tools yet. My organization permits the use of AI within controlled workflows. We're creating specific AI tools, so those proprietary platforms and tools. And also we get that kind of mixed. I discourage the use of AI for indexing because it does it poorly versus I actually use it for code because it does it well. So there's that identification of there are things that AI is good at and there's things that AI is not, and we're acting accordingly as an organization. Now, despite the high adoption, concerns abound. What's really, really interesting to me is that despite the fact that the service provider segment has such higher adoption than their peers in other segments, they have the same concerns at almost the same percentages. Hallucinations at almost 90%. Inadequate controls around the use of copyrighted material is very high. The concern that we saw highest from libraries around AI-generated books and other content flooding major retail platforms is very high. Legal liability and inaccurate, false, and biased training data. These are all major pain points and concerns for the service provider segment. And incredibly, 0%, not a single one, said that they have no concerns or pain points around the adoption of AI. So there is a level of education and concern and awareness, even though adoption is proceeding. These are things that folks are aware of within this segment. We also asked for guidance as needed. Service providers actively want guidance on how to approach AI, and here are the highest areas that folks indicated that they wanted that training on. Like we saw in other segments, metadata was number one. I've mentioned before in prior programming that I would be interested to see in future surveys and kind of take apart a little bit is that an indication of BISG's association with metadata and the work that we do in that realm, or is that really like the single point where people are looking for training on and have the most questions around? Translation, I think, was also a really interesting data point. Looking at the publisher data and the library segment data, translation didn't mark nearly as high, although it was still listed. So that internationalization and the discoverability and the trying to reach the largest audience possible, that level of language accessibility is a key priority for service providers that we don't see quite as strongly in other areas. And then I wanted to share some more quotes. I think it's important to not look exclusively at the numbers, to have the human aspect and have the perspective and the feeling behind the numbers. So I'll just leave this up here for a second, but just kind of frame that we do see kind of a broad range of responses. And there's almost a level of resignation where we're seeing, as the data shows as well, this disconnect between organizational adoption and personal perspective, especially around ethics. So let's take a look at a little bit more detail about how service providers responded compared to other segments and what those differences show. As I mentioned, the service providers are using as individuals AI almost double what we saw from libraries and from publishers. So you're seeing that 82% plus from the service provider segment of individuals saying, yes, we use AI for work versus the 42 and 43 for libraries and publishers, respectively. We also want to take a little bit of a deeper look at how organizations are approaching official policy and guidelines. This is one of the metrics that I called out as really impressive. Again, we have between 60 and 70% of service providers saying that they actually have an official policy or set of guidelines. You look at libraries, it's really low. You look at publishers, it's just over 30%. So it's interesting to see that some of the segments that have expressed the most concerns, library, very, very vocal about AI concerns, also have the lowest level of reported policy. One other thing I want to point out here, that last column for each of these data sets, the turquoise one, is the I'm not sure. That's someone saying, I don't know if my organization has an official AI policy or not. And the service providers, we got zero responses for that. Everyone knows if there's a policy or set of guidelines or not. So I think that level of internal knowledge about where the organization stands regarding AI is also really important to kind of note and clock here. So some key takeaways. We know that individuals at service providers have the highest AI adoption rate of any segment surveyed, and they strongly believe, compared to their peers, that AI training is a valuable use of their time. They have organizational clarity. Service providers lead in organizational AI use and possess greater internal clarity around use, guidelines, and policy, despite sharing common pain points with other segments. Again, they have the same concerns at almost the same rates as libraries and publishers, but they have stronger internal guidelines. There's more organizations in this segment that have their policies in place already. They have their guardrails. They may be using enterprise models and walled garden areas to do their work, and they know how they are using AI and what their guidelines are. And then a level of commonality is that desire for guidance. Best practices are highly sought by both providers and publishers with a specific focus on metadata as a continuing across the board key area of interest. So what this tells me and what I really want the message that we take away from this to be is that education, transparency, and partnership across the supply chain is needed more than ever. We only tackle industry challenges and major moments of change like this when we work together. And I think that there's a lot that these segments can do to work together to be better business partners to help uplift everybody. BISG loves the lift all boats approach. So we have this data. We've looked at the three main segments of the data from the supply chain survey. Where do we go from here? At this point, I'm going to stop presenting data. We've talked about numbers enough, and I want to get into a real conversation. So, Brooke, let's talk a little bit about the data. What jumped out at you the first time that you reviewed the data through your work through the AI working group? When you read the white paper, when you looked at the specific segment results, what jumped out at you and was surprising?
Honestly, there were so many aspects that jumped out at me. It's difficult to even focus because it was a very robust report, which you only showed portions of that data here today. Hopefully, the people on this call have also been able to tune into some of the other webinars around this. But related to the vendor survey specifically, it stands out to me that one of the biggest concerns and one of the biggest barriers from publishers and librarians around the use of AI are things like, concerns over copyright protection and the, security of AI and governance and policy. And the vendors, the suppliers have gotten that for the most part figured out, at least to a much greater extent. That's certainly out of necessity. I mean, the suppliers are required to do that. Publishers, the first question they're going to ask if they're using any suppliers in this industry that are using AI in their tooling for publishers are going to be asking about are going to be putting them through procurement and making sure that they're following the rules. So there's a sensible reason why vendors have gotten it
Hmm.
figured out, but they certainly have. And a lot of those vendors are either using AI in the services that they're providing to publishers, or they are AI specific vendors, that have come, into the publishing industry in the last 3 years. And there was a data point that you shared, which was really astonishing to me, which was somewhere around 11% of publishers are actually using the AI tools that have been built specifically for the publishing industry. But these vendors have figured out the governance, the protection. They're using the closed AI models. They're being careful and they're being required to. So the low adoption rate, while instead I think a lot of the industry, the publishers and the librarians are using the, chat GPTs, the Geminis, and they're kind of figuring it out. And that's why there's not
Hmm.
as much control around it, but they're not adopting the products that were built specifically for them. So it raises questions around why, and where is that gap and how can we bridge that?
Yeah. And I think it's also important to note out that saying that you have an official set of AI policies and guidelines doesn't mean that you're endorsing AI either. You could absolutely have a policy and set of guidelines that says that your organization doesn't want to use AI, but it's really important to have that clarity across your organization, that transparency between leadership and staff, and make sure that everyone is on alignment. Because without that, you run into risks of having lack of synergy and experimenting with AI in unprotected environments, which we
Yeah.
should all know by now is not great for your data,
Yeah.
for your business, or for your customers.
Yeah. One other thing that I thought was really interesting just in the slides that you were going through here is you showed the percentage of the respondents who are using AI for metadata versus data analysis versus marketing, things, and how they then, the next slide was how they anticipate to use it in the future. And metadata was highlighted later as one of the things that people care most about, like really understanding guidelines around. This makes sense because metadata is so crucial to this industry
Mhm.
and to the success of a book. And it also has been a bit of low-hanging fruit, to use AI. You can use it pretty successfully for metadata. But I noticed that when you go from slide to slide, how they're using it now and how they anticipate using it, metadata stayed pretty much consistent, which indicates to me that it's gotten to be one of the more matured areas that doesn't expect to grow as much. It was somewhere around 51%, I think, that are using it today for metadata, and they anticipate using it at 55%. Whereas you then have data analysis was somewhere around, I think, 55% and jumps up to 75%. And I think that's because of the advancements in the models and the tooling that's available. Agentic AI makes it a lot more accurate to do data analysis now than it was in really just 6 months ago. So I think that there's a huge appetite for being able to use AI with all of that data that is so robust throughout the whole publishing workflow. Whereas with metadata, it's still of really high interest, but it's almost reached its level of maturity to some extent.
Yeah. I think that you could also make the argument that advances in AI have made aspects like data analysis more accessible to folks that previously would have said, this is not my wheelhouse. Like, I'm not going to touch this. So it is encouraging that we could be seeing a more data informed book publishing industry where people are looking at numbers and figures and making more informed decisions about some of the things that they do. So that is one thing that I'm really interested to see when we do that 2026 survey, is if is that something that reflects that when we look at those year over year numbers. Are people using data analysis more? Do they anticipate using data analysis more as time goes on by? Just as one simple metric figure.
Yeah.
Um, and kind of on that same thread, since we are about to launch the 2026 survey, can we touch on a little bit about things that you expect to change? Like, what can we kind of anticipate in that year over year change? Again, remembering that this survey was launched last summer, we're going to be launching the new survey this summer.
Mhm.
Year over time, what can we expect?
Yeah. What I've seen so far in just this year at the beginning of 2026 is a big difference in how how publishers are interacting and what they want to learn about AI, which kind of indicates what they are actually adopting and using it for. A year ago, I was being asked to do webinars mainly on what are the tools that you can use for marketing, for book marketing. And that at the time was kind of low-hanging fruit because marketing was one of the least risky areas to use AI. It was immediately impactful because that's where you're making money, is in the sales of your book. So it was kind of low hanging fruit in that way. But the things that I've been asked to do this year are really all around data analysis and agentic AI, and that's because of the
Mm,
tooling advancements. But the industry does seem really eager to figure out, okay, these tools are now available. I can now have some real autonomous AI working to do to like you said, Brooke, to run workflows in more of a data-backed way. How can I actually employ this? So I can see that there is more openness to kind of moving outside of the first ways that we were all using AI and really trying to explore the different ways of doing it. I hope that what will change is the governance aspect. I think governance and training and kind of like just that all of that is kind of also around literacy, AI literacy.
mhm,
What I have found in some of the trainings that I do and some of the consulting work that I do in this industry and outside of this industry is that low AI literacy is a risk in so many different ways. I mean, not only the very obvious reasons that like you have access to Chat GPT, you think you've turned off AI training, you actually didn't. You think you're using a model that is safe, but you have this manuscript that you need to do something with, and you're just going to put it into your Chat GPT. And you don't think you're going to get caught. You don't think there's an audit trail, but actually that is obviously a huge risk. So the 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 training and helping people really understand how AI works and what it's actually doing so that you're not taking those own individual risks. And that ladders up to the big difference that you see in the research report between the individual usage versus the company usage and adoption of AI.
mhm,
Whereas company usage lags individual usage, and company usage needs to catch up, and governance and policy accordingly. And values, culture, everything needs to kind of align so that your individuals are using it aligned with how your company's values, your company's intentions, your company's policies. So I hope that will progress in future.
100%, 100%. Could you talk a little bit about your own experience with why you think that the vendor segment is so far ahead of other segments as far with governance, guideline, and policy? Either from your Shimmer perspective, or I think we talked about this a little bit in conversation preparing for this call. What are some of the differences that you think necessitate that difference in the data?
I think the biggest thing is that vendors have no choice but to figure this out. When you're building and selling AI tools or services that are going to incorporate AI in any way, your clients are asking questions to you about governance. Publishers, particularly larger ones, but also smaller ones as well, are going to put you through procurement processes. They're going to require you to articulate how you're handling their data, what your model governance is, what models are you using, what levels of models are you using, what types of contracts do you have, enterprise versus not, what are the IP protections that you have. I mean, we Shimmer has had these questions being asked since 3 years ago. So these are just very obvious questions that are going to come to vendors in this industry. So we have external accountability, which is basically forcing us as vendors to accelerate in this space, whereas publishers and librarians are largely using AI in a more voluntary way at the moment. They're not being forced, or they're not being, pushed externally as much. The authors are going to start to ask questions, and they already are, and that's definitely going to put more pressure on the publishers as well. But the pressure that has been forced on vendors so far is not even close to that same extent when it comes to other, parts of this industry. So, and I think what holds back publishers, librarians, the non-vendor part of the industry is that it's very difficult to write a policy, determine, governance frameworks. This isn't something that you just put in place, like that. It takes knowledge, it takes probably some legal expense, so I think actually this is an area where I think the BISG and other organizations like BISG could play a real part, because having templates for these things, what a policy template might look like for a publisher, large, small, same thing for libraries, that could be super helpful for the industry, and the vendors who have already conquered all of this could help, to develop some of those tools for the industry.
Absolutely. One thing I'd like to draw you out a little bit further on is that we saw in the data that most, over half, I think, of the service providers that responded reported being from companies with over 100 employees.
Hmm.
So we can't talk about this without talking about resources.
Hmm.
How do you then reframe that question? How does it apply for small publishers and smaller service providers? What are the differences for those organizations, those companies across segments that don't have the same staff level, don't have the same number of resources, and are operating on, often shoestring budgets and just trying to put good books out into the world?
Yeah, I think there are opportunities for small businesses and large businesses when it comes to AI. I mean, I'm a small business myself. I've been a part of a small business for most of my career, and you are required to wear many more hats when you're working in a small business than when you're working in a large business. So, from just speaking from personal experience in the operations of Shimmer, we're a small business. I'm, as chief commercial officer, I'm responsible for accounting, finance, operations. I also do, legal, and do some of this alongside our CEO and our leadership. But I'm also responsible for marketing, sales, and the customer experience side of the business. This is a lot of hats to wear, and it wouldn't be possible for me without being able to work alongside the tools that I have developed with AI. And that's not me replacing the humans in my business. That is me not having humans in my business and not having budget to have humans in my business yet at this small stage in order to do all of these things that I'm able to leverage AI for. So I've built out agentic systems to help me there. Because I'm a small business, I have the flexibility to do that. We didn't already have bureaucracy in place or policies that were telling us that we couldn't do this. We develop as a small business. In some ways, you have the advantage of being able to develop with AI and alongside AI
Mhm.
as it develops. Of course, large companies have access to more resources, meaning humans that are experts in AI, that can train your business in AI, humans that can uh, you know, figure out policy and all of the different guardrails. But there's also a real tooling difference here. And actually, hadn't realized this until very recently. When you're looking at like enterprise contracts with some of the companies, like Claude, for example, you
Mhm.
oftentimes have to have a pretty expensive contract in order to get that enterprise protection on the AI models that you're using. So like one of the companies that I'm consulting with, not in the publishing industry, outside of the publishing industry, has a Microsoft contract, which gives them the protections that they need for the very sensitive data that they're using. They're in healthcare, actually. So they have arguably even more sensitive data than here. They have to abide by HIPAA
Mhm.
rules and whatnot. So, very similar to concerns that we have here in this industry around books. Microsoft, they were able to get the high level of protection contract that they need for their size of business, but we were trying to get them access to Claude, and they weren't able to get it with the number of employees that they had. Now, are there holes they might be able to jump through? Yes, but it isn't as easy for a small business to get the access that they need, in a safe way as well.
Yeah. It's a major challenge. We in our workflow committee have had multiple deliberations around how do you define a small business? How do you address the challenges within small business? We did a really interesting series that was on small business solutions, and metadata was one of the big things that came up. And it's certainly a topic that is top of mind for
Yeah.
BISG. Um, One thing I'd like to go into a little bit further, and I want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for Q&A. So folks, this is your couple minute warning. Start dropping questions in the Q&A as you have them. I'd like to talk a little bit more about partnerships. So how the different segments can work together. How can vendors be better business partners and provide resources and training and bring the the level of protection and guidance further up? How do we make that accessible? How do we approach that? How do we be better business partners with each other?
First, I think awareness to the vendors that there's as big of a problem and as big of a gap as there is here. I mean, I this opened my eyes just looking at this report and being involved in this webinar that there is such a low adoption of publishing specific AI. And there is such a gap between the governance that the vendors are employing versus the rest of the industry. So I think awareness so that vendors understand I might need to change the way that I'm approaching the industry and how I'm even talking about my tools, So that's, one thing that I'm now considering is rather than these are the features of this product, these are the, benefits that you're going to get from using this particular AI product or this particular service that's using AI, it might need to be more around what is your policy that you currently have in place? What are your concerns around AI? How can we help you? Really kind of trying to bridge that gap in the governance area before you go into the specific tooling that's available. And I think that publishers, I think the word, vendor and supplier doesn't help the vendor and supplier side in some ways. It almost makes you seem a bit, subordinate. You think you're going to come in being sold to, so it doesn't help. Whereas in this particular instance, the vendors and the suppliers are really the experts in many ways in when it comes to AI. So publishers kind of understanding that and going to the suppliers of the industry and leveraging them. They would all be happy to support, questions, trainings around AI. And that you use the word partnership, and I think that's exactly what it needs to be more of.
Right.
It's more of a partnership between the two ends so that both can progress at the same rate.
Absolutely. We talk a lot in the supply chain committee and across our other programming about the need to focus on industry partnerships, the printer publisher partnership, and moving away from a client model and more towards we're business partners. We're all needed for the long-term health of the industry, and we have to work together and treat this as partnerships
Mhm.
if we want to have industry sustainability. Um, Before we switch over to Q&A,
Mhm.
it's a little bit of a sticky topic, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about the pain points that people have. I found it really interesting that pain points were something that we saw across all segments at pretty broadly close ranges. The fact that service providers have over 80% of concerns reported for hallucinations. There's
Mhm.
that emphasis on copyright, even that shared concern between service providers and the library segment around content flooding platforms. We're seeing that Publishers are excited about the potential use of AI to increase accessibility and discoverability, and there's more content being made than ever. Libraries are overwhelmed by the amount of content they're receiving. They're kind of at the bottom end of that
Yeah.
supply chain stream, and they're now facing challenges around how do you filter out what is accurate and what is not content. So
Yeah.
um, facing all of these challenges, how do service providers and folks in that industry partner will approach those ethical challenges and address concerns around accuracy and copyright? Are there specific tools that they recommend that are more accurate than others, that are safer than others? Kind of thinking beyond the walled garden and the enterprise model or not? Like, how do we take that
Yeah.
conversation a step further?
So there are several different things to unpick there. The first one is about kind of quality and hallucinations. First of all, the models just have developed over the last 3 years and they have gotten better with hallucinations, but they still do it. I was using Claude, one of my paid versions of Claude the other day, and I didn't give it enough information about what the question I was asking it to do for me, and it completely hallucinated numbers. And I have to tell you, I was stunned because I haven't experienced that with Claude or like some of the higher level like paid models in quite some time. And I was using Opus 4.7, so it was really strange that that happened. But my point is, even though they're progressing, that still can happen. So I think the difference between the the companies that are figuring it out and the people who are using it correctly and avoiding being hurt by the hallucinations and like missing them and not realizing that they're there is really in the mindset of how you're building AI into your business. So if you're actually in the mindset that you're building AI into your workflows and you're using it not to replace your thinking, but you're using it to supplement your thinking, you're then going to set up your workflow properly. You're going to make sure that you have the human checks in the places that you need to. You also are going to understand how to build in automated AI agent driven QC checks so that when hallucinations happen, they're checking themselves so that they stop it from happening. That's not possible when you're just using chat. When you're just going into Gemini and chatting with it or Chat GPT, that QC level is possible when you're actually chaining together and building out a workflow with AI. So when you're using AI for something that is critically important that you don't hallucinate, like data analysis, financial things, you need to make sure that you are using the right tools. And I believe that agentic AI is the right space for that so that you can build in the right tools that the AI is bringing in for the data analysis. I don't want to get into too much detail that's going to confuse this conversation, but LLMs were not trained on numbers, they were trained on text. So the reason that they were so terrible at numbers, a couple of years ago or even a year ago is because LLMs weren't trained to crunch numbers. What the agents do that you work with today is they'll pull in Python. They'll pull in different tools in order to do right tool for the right job, so they'll pull in Python in order to do math. So I think it's really about understanding there is a level of education and training needed so that you're building AI in your workflows appropriately. When it comes to like ethical concerns, there are lots of different reasons why there are ethical concerns around AI. One is environmental. There certainly are environmental concerns around AI. There's also environmental concerns around printing books and driving big trucks around to take them to bookstores. You end up getting comfortable with what is benefiting you, and you basically balance the cost and the benefit, and make sure that those two things balance out. So I think there just needs to be more education around that, less scare tactics, but more education. And so you're also using AI only for the things that you need it to, because you don't need to use AI for absolutely everything. So it's really about like figuring out where like how much energy consumption you're using and what are the accurate figures around that, as compared to the other energy that you're using that might be just as bad. Um, and then the final area I'll touch on with when it comes to ethics is just the disclosure or the transparency around AI use. I mean, this is a really tough one. You know, it's difficult. There's a lot of question around whether the industry should be using AI detection tools or whether AI detection tools are not even accurate. You know, so should a publisher be using AI detection tools, you know, with their authors? My argument would be if you don't know if an AI detection tool is accurate, then that's not something that we should be subjecting our authors to, but we should be building trust, which is what this industry has been built on to begin with between, you know, publisher and author. And it again comes down to your policies and your contracts. Your authors should understand what your requirements are around AI usage, and your authors should understand what your requirements are. Are you using AI in their marketing? Are you using it in various stages? And the openness of that information, of that knowledge, and just transparency so that your authors and you are on the same page, I think is just the trust that this industry has always been built on rather than using tools to kind of out, you know, AI usage.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for this. I have one kind of fun question I'd like to ask, and then we're going to dive straight into the audience Q&A. So we talked about hallucinations, and one thing that I've really come to enjoy asking folks when I have these kinds of conversations is, what is the funniest hallucination or like AI goof that you've seen? And I'll share one of myself, as I do use AI to help convert shorthand notes to more formal meeting minutes. Always human in the loop, always having that review process. But in one instance, AI didn't have my last name and it decided to put metadata as my last name. So all of the notes were Brooke metadata, Miss metadata. So what would be a maybe not comparable example, but a
You,
funny goof?
oh my goodness. That's a great question. That's a tough one. Um, I can't really think about a goof, but let me tell you something that I did in a personal basis that I thought was one of the cooler things that I did with AI this year. My parents collect antiques, and they have about thousands of antiques in their house. And every time I go home, they tell me, you know, this bottle is you know, pre-World War II, and this one you should make sure you save and give down to our grandchildren, or you should donate this one to the Denora blah 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 society. And I said to them last time I was home, I can't possibly remember all of this. Like, how can we manage to make sure that we do the right things with your antiques? So I built an app in an AI software called Lovable, which allows my parents to take pictures of each of their antiques and tell me whether they want to donate it or whether they want to, you know,
Mm.
save it, etc. And then it connects to Perplexity. So with the picture, Perplexity will go out to the internet and give it a valuation. It'll see if it can find that antique on any other, you know, reseller site so it can give it a value and then give it a you know, whether it's give it a quality rank, a check, and, you know, then a description so I can then post it. So that's a place now that my parents have really loved, kind of storing their antiques.
That's a fun example. Thank you for sharing
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's dive into Q&A. We've got some questions coming in, so I want to make sure that we get to these. So our first question, I've read that there is no way to stop hallucinations and flat interpretations from these models. One might say that they're fundamental to how the models work. Uh, they cite a couple different code cases, but the core question is, outside of discrete and verifiable areas like programming or math, how can I trust its use with metadata specifically? What technologies are being implemented to increase accuracy?
Yeah, I think this is interesting because you did see in the research that metadata was one of the areas that the industry still wants to know more about and get guidelines around. Metadata is tricky because I think a lot of people are currently using the, you know, chat GPT and like the more what I would call like general models to do their metadata because it can do it. But the problem is those models haven't been specialized on, you know, Onyx or Thema or BISAC. They don't really understand the nuts and bolts. So this is an area where I think some of the vendors that have figured out that have specialized models on metadata, and many of them exist in the publishing industry now, have th those are going to be more accurate. You know, those have been trained specifically on this industry's metadata and this industry, you know. So I think that's the space where you need to really think about a specialized model versus a general model.
Thank you for that.
Because it's difficult to know. I mean, your metadata can look fantastic when it comes out of one of these models, but until you actually test it and
Mhm.
does it make an impact and how do you test it? What are your metrics? You know, so you know I think that that makes it tricky with metadata using those
Yeah.
general models.
And with accuracy, the training was really key. We were having a discussion yesterday about the difference the in different AI models' ability to accurately assign BISAC codes based on whether it was using the actual BISAC data that BISG owns, the actual code list, versus what is just floating around on the internet, what the Reddit
Yeah.
thread tells you that you should assign for your codes. So specifying your sources and your context again on an enterprise model in a closed garden environment is going to give you much more accurate data than using a free version that is looking at a very broad swath of information out there. So
Yeah.
setting accurate guardrails when you're prompting, again, within an enterprise model is going to give you more accurate data. And that is one immediately actionable step that you can take to increase your accuracy if that is an area that you are interested in moving towards.
Yeah.
Um, we have a question from an audience member. With data reporting, do we know if publishers are using built-in AI tools like Power BI and anticipate that will increase? Or are we seeing publishers moving to MCPs and agents?
I have seen publishers move to MCPs and agents to a lesser extent, but mainly because those are just some of the newest capabilities. I do think that that is where the industry is going to be going. Now, the tools like Power BI that are already built into like your Microsoft, you know, subscriptions and whatnot, those make a lot of sense to use because one, if you have a just to take Microsoft, if you already have a contract with Microsoft with your company, it likely already has in the protections that you need for your company. So those are safer AI tools to use right off the bat. So requiring giving access to your business for those AI tools is going to keep you safer even before you have like policies and specific, you know, governance in place. But I do think that it's interesting you mentioned MCP. So what for anyone who is on this call that doesn't understand what some of this terminology is, an agent is an AI that can actually take autonomous action for you. So not any longer just kind of giving you answers and chatting back and forth, but actually taking the action to do the thing that you're asking it to do. And MCP servers are kind of like it's connectors. It's allowing you to access your data that is in other places. And this is a really important I think it's important to start moving in the direction where you're understanding what those options are because in the future, I mean, probably not in the too distant future, it the way that like softwares that you're currently accessing are going to evolve are you're not it's really going to be like your agent talking to my agent. You're no longer going to need to access the software, the interface that sits in front of all of your you know book scan data, for example. What you're going to want is you're just going to want access to that data within the workflows that you're building within your business, your agentic systems. So it's the future will be about these connectors and agents talking to agents, agents working with agents to get access to the data and passing that information back and forth. So I do think that that's an important space to start educating on.
Yeah. And as we see that transition, I think that accuracy is going to become, it's already a huge concern, but I don't see that going away. I do expect that to be a equally high pain point when we do the 2026 survey. Kind
And
of
now
building
when you're
off.
talking about things like that though, if we're talking about like connectors, that's calling data. That's not that's there's not it's not there's no way hallucination can affect that type of call because you're really just pulling specifically the data that came from one platform into into another. So it's not asking the LLM to make any type of calculation. In that situation, it's just a different way to access the data that sits in other systems that you're already accessing. So
That's a
that
good
keeps your data safer.
clarification.
It's at, you know, yeah.
Thanks for that. We have another question. Sam has asked, how are publishers and service providers actually integrating AI content into content delivery and production workflows? So we saw that we have that data around is it being used in workflows, but not the granularity of how it's being used in workflows. Can you provide a little bit of a perspective on that and what you're seeing?
I think that content is really one of the first places that publishers, and probably one of the most prevalent places that publishers are using AI. I mean, the data showed it as well, at least currently, you know, marketing is one of the big places. In terms of content, I mean, it's everything from metadata to digital advertising to, you know, videos, images, you know, book descriptions. There are lots of ways that publishers are using it for content. Um, Not from the perspective of actually writing the book is not what I'm referring to. I'm really talking more about then the promotion of the book. That's where really the area that I'm the most familiar with. Brooke, I don't know if you have anything to add in terms of like the production side of the industry.
Yeah, not specifics that I could cite right off the top of my head right now. I did hear a really interesting use case at recent manufacturing programming around how a printer is using AI, and it was around things like the internationalization using translation tools to make sure that their whole workforce, despite whatever language they speak, they're getting the accurate information, the town hall updates and the training guides in their native language so that they can have that level setting level of understanding. Administrative and operational, of course, is also very high across the board from the folks that I've spoken to that are using it and are willing to disclose that. Um, we are only have a few minutes left of time, so I do want to kind of rapid fire through a couple more questions so that we can make sure that we get to these. So, an attendee has asked, is there a base or core set of questions that we as publishers need to ask new vendors? And then we are looking to onboard as a new supplier source. So, what does a publisher ask their partner about their use of AI? What does that
Mhm.
onboarding look like?
Definitely ensuring that they're not training the AI models. I mean, I think this is the most obvious one is they're not training AI models with your content, understanding not just how the AI is accessing your content, but also how your content is being stored
Mhm.
when you know during and after the AI is accessing it for whatever way they are, so that you know, so you can understand that your content is safe. So it's kind of like those, you know, whether it's being analyzed within an encrypted, you know, closed system. You know, anytime you're giving out your content, especially if we're talking about manuscripts or like really sensitive, you know, data, you want to make sure that it's going to be stored in a safe place. Um, I think those are really the two most important questions when it comes to kind of letting your content out the door. After that, it will be things around the, you know, transparency. You know, if you're working with a company that is doing AI marketing or AI advertising, are they being transparent about the fact that they're using AI? I'm not saying that they should be or shouldn't be. You know, that's really just a question that's up in the air. But if that's something, it really depends on how it aligns with your own policies and what you're promising back to your authors. If you have certain contracts with your authors, then those are the questions that you need to make sure that your suppliers are adhering to. And they might be flexible in the way that they are willing to adhere to some of what your, you know, requests and needs are as well.
Thank you. Well, we've only got 1 minute left, so I think that we're about out of time for questions. But what I will say is that I'm happy to return to these. We'll put them in a document. Brooke, you and I can collaborate and come up with some answers for these, and we can share them when we distribute the recording and the slide deck so that all of our attendees get their questions answered and have those resources. So the last thing that I'd like to touch on before we close out is that we are having our 2026 AI industry survey coming out soon. We're really excited to partner again with BookNet Canada. We thank them for their support and we'll be fielding the survey mid this year. So we expect to have that out very, very soon. We've touched a little bit already on some of the things that we anticipate seeing in that. We're adding some new questions to reflect the greater granularity and the needs in the industry. The questions that you guys as attendees for our AI webinar series have been heavily factored into any edits that we've made to the survey. So thank you very much for your participation. You are directly informing the data that we're gathering. So with that, I just want to say, Brooke, thank you so much. It's been so much fun talking to another Brooke in the book world about this. We really appreciate the emphasis on education and transparency and just making sure that the knowledge is out there. Looking back at some of those qualitative responses, the broad consensus is AI is here. It's not going anywhere. So we need to understand how to ethically and efficiently and responsibly implement it and really understand what are the risks and the opportunities involved. So Brooke, thank you so much for sharing your time and your experience with us for those efforts. And we really value your participation in the working group. So thank you so much for today.
Thank you, Brooke. Appreciate it. My pleasure.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
everyone
everybody.
for attending. Take care.
Bye.